This is Duke University.
I would like to introduce the members of this panel. And for that, I will sit down. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with Jehanne Gheith, who's on my far right here. Jehanne is both an associate professor and a licensed clinical social worker. As a professor, her work has been mostly on Russia and mostly about issues having to do with memory, social justice, and narrative. Her research topics have ranged from 19th century Russian women writers to interviews with survivors of the Gulag to her current project on Russian hospice. As a hospice social worker also, and bereavement counselor, she works with families and patients to negotiate the tricky territory of a terminal diagnosis and how to live as richly as possible with the time remaining. Currently, she's figuring out how these two careers can best work together. She teaches courses in end-of-life care issues at Duke and is seeking other ways to bring lively discourse on these issues to campus through, for instance, performance art, practitioners' talks, and other kinds of conversations, maybe just like this one. I think I read that and I think the death of Ivan Ilyich. I'm like,
oh yeah, we start with that in a lot of my classes.
I bet. Okay. So next, I'd like to introduce Lauren Henschel. Lauren, by the way, well, I'll tell you in a second. Lauren is a senior at Duke University studying visual media studies, documentary film, and cultural anthropology. She is a passionate documentary artist with a wide range of cinematographic skills and a desire to portray stories in empathetic ways and positively impact the lives of others. As a filmmaker and photographer, she has produced films of high-profile artists for MySpace, documented the lives of the Mosquito Indians in Nicaragua, and created a documentary about a young woman's battle with cancer that was prominently featured by influential nonprofit organizations such as Stand Up to Cancer. Her current body of work, Indelible, which was previously displayed at Carnegie Hall, is an art installation piece combining still images, audio narratives, and video footage to present anonymous stories of individuals with scars and the manifestation of that pain on the human body. And around you, on the walls, you'll see some pieces from that work of hers, which she told me before we sat down here is something that she's been working on since high school.
Yeah.
And envisions maybe never being done with. So when you're gazing off, please gaze at the photo. There's some great, the quotations from the people she's photographed are really worth reading also if you have a chance. In addition to her success in the documentary field, Lauren was one of the founding members and current co-editor-in-chief of The Bite, Duke's premier food publication. So she's a Renaissance person. And finally, I want to go to Leslie. I'm not going to do that whole introduction I did last time. Okay.
It was beautiful.
I'm going to do this one. Leslie Jamison is a novelist and essayist and journalist. I'm going to say it, even though you deny it. Her work has been published in Best New American Voices 2008, A Public Space, Black Warrior Review, Harper's, the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Oxford American, and many others. She attended Harvard University and the Iowa Writers Workshop and is a PhD candidate in English literature at Yale, where her dissertation work centers on addiction and recovery narratives. Jamison's first novel, The Gin Closet, was published by the Free Press in 2010, and Jamison's second book, Our Occasion for Being Here, The Empathy Exams, is an essay collection published by Grey Wolf Press and debuted in April 2014, debuted at number 11 on the New York Times-bestseller list, which was, I remember all the essayists, on Twitter going, oh my God, it's so amazing. There's hope for us yet. The book received wide acclaim from critics, and you could go on for hours, but one of the strongest things that was said came from Olivia Lang, writing for the New York Times, in which she said, it's hard to imagine a stronger, more thoughtful voice emerging this year. And I would add to that for many years. So thank you all for being with us today to talk about ghost pain, caregiving, documentary, and radical empathy. And so we talked about how we would do this, and they've had a chance to sit and talk with each other, and we traded emails and so forth. But what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Jehanne to start by talking about briefly, how you responded to something you've read in here, but also especially how that dovetails with your own work. And then we're just going to go back and forth that way for a while, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Okay? So, Jehanne.
So I'm going to start out, first thank you, Duncan, that was a really nice introduction for all of us, and start off sort of impressionistically and give you 3 quotes that have, well actually 4, that have resonated with me and that I hope you'll see sort of throughout the rest of what I'm going to say, taking them absolutely out of context. But from the title essay, the first 3 are from the title essay. Other students seem to understand that empathy is always perched precariously between gift and invasion. Second quote. This was the double blade of how I felt about anything that hurt. I wanted someone else to feel it with me, and also I wanted it entirely for myself. Third quotation. Empathy is a kind of care, but it's not the only kind of care, and it's not always enough. I want to think that's what Dr. G was thinking. I need to look at him and see the opposite of my fear, not its echo. And the last quotation is from The Devil's Bait, the essay on Morgellons. When does empathy actually reinforce the pain it wants to console? So I have 12 more pages of those, but I'm not going to. And they're all wonderful. I could just do that, and it would be a wonderful book. But what I wanted to do instead is start with that, and then start with 2 big questions that we may fruitfully discuss later, or you may decide we want to focus on other things. Either of those is totally fine. But they're 2 of the big questions that the book raised for me. 2 of the about 17,000 big questions that it raised for me. So the first is, does empathy have a social value, and in what ways? And the second is, in the book, I have written down Leslie Jamison, I'll say you, show how different kinds of systems, medical, governmental, prison, cultural, gender, informal systems of thought in your tentative and powerful reclamation of saccharin, discrete systems like the Barclay Marathon, how do those work for and against empathy? In my hospice work, I actually often find that the whole insurance system works radically against empathy. So that's where that question comes from for me. And so when systems work against it and we feel empathy is important, what does it look like to enact, hold on to, perform, live empathy? So, as Duncan just said, I am both a hospice social worker and a professor of Russian culture, and I'm going to guess that most of you know what professors do and that few of you know what hospice social workers do. And so what I wanted to do actually first was just ask you to give 3 really quick associations. There's nothing right, nothing wrong here, but the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear, and I won't be hurt, that comes to your mind when you hear the words hospice social worker. So just don't think, just what do you think?
Depressing.
Depressing. Kind of goes along with Russia, yes. Sorry, what?
End of life support.
End of life support. One more.
Accompaniment.
Accompaniment. Beautiful, thank you. So my view of it is that it's exactly that I am accompanying patients, and sometimes depressing, accompanying patients and families, however that's defined, in this amazing and difficult transition, right? You know, it's one of the biggest transitions of our lives and something we'll all have to face. Everybody does it differently, and so different people want me to accompany them in different ways. For some people it means helping them, for a same-sex couple, helping them get married so that the surviving partner will have some rights after the death. For some people it means talking. For some people it means much more practical help. But I think always it's work in which the capacity for empathy and self-insight are basic. And it's also work about loss and translation. And that's another place I think there's some intersections with the empathy exams. Most people get that once no further treatment is possible, they will die. Most people also cannot imagine what that will look like and kind of expect that once they've made the decision, they'll just sort of continue in the state that they're in and then they'll die. And so my work is often to help them imagine, if they're ready for it, that that's not the case and that they're likely to weaken in some of the ways that it might look like, and how are they gonna, that means they might want to see the grandchildren this week instead of next week because they might not have the energy next week, right? So I mean, it matters that you know this in terms of how you're gonna live most richly with this until you die. And I think it is precisely why I want to bring this kind of discussion to Duke's campus more, is because this is going to happen to most of us, right? We are all going to die. And so it seems really important to think about this ahead of time, because most of the families that I work with are having to make critical decisions that really matter in a time of crisis without ever having thought about any of this before. So I wanted to talk about one of the ways that this can look. I hope to get to talk about two of them, but let me just start with one. So we're going to call this woman Susan, and she said pretty early on in the process, she said to me, I kind of think I should be doing really deep work all the time and having conversations with my family about meaning, but all I want to do is watch dumb TV shows. And so we laughed and we talked about her energy levels, which would have made it pretty difficult for her to do much more besides watch dumb TV shows. And we talked about the shows she was finding comfort in, ones that allowed her to identify with the characters, to have some agency, to be in stories. And then the day came when Susan had to hire 24/7 caregivers, and that was hard, letting these people into her home. And then one week she could still go to the bathroom herself, but suddenly she needed the caregiver to help her get up from the toilet. This was sort of shocking to her too. The next week she needed a bedside commode. She could no longer make it to the bathroom herself. 5 days later she was in a diaper, and then several days after that she died. And in each of these losses she mourned them, and she needed to and wanted to mourn them. And my job and very great gift was to be with her and her family in that mourning and in that leave taking. And so I think that shows a little, or I guess one other thing is that her son, as we were sitting with his mom, said to me, so after this you're going to go on to your next patient, right? I said, yeah. And he said, so you must be pretty detached from this. That must be how you're able to do it. And I said, actually, I don't think I could do this work if I were detached from it. I think I have to be deeply connected, and I have to have my own feelings about it, and I have to figure out how to use them, those feelings, that understanding of connection with you all, in the best way I can for you, and get taken care of other places. You know, I have a therapist, I have friends. But I think that is the work of hospice in many ways, is taking that connection, taking that sorrow that you feel too, and doing your best to use it for them. And sometimes you're successful and sometimes you're not. But, can I have one more scenario? Okay. So a very different scenario that shows the limits of empathy. I have another patient, and we'll call him Fred, who used pretty serious drugs most of his life. He was poor, he was African American. He had a girlfriend of 15 years who lived with him and helped him pay the rent every month. He had a niece who lived with them and helped care for him. The day after he died, I got a call to come to the house. What I found was a landlord who was saying that since no one but the patient was on the lease, everyone would have to leave that day. And the police were there, and they said that was in fact the case. I checked, just to make sure that it was, and it was in fact the case. So unsurprisingly, the niece and the girlfriend were angry. Unfortunately, they expressed that anger in ways that made the situation worse, where the landlord had initially said, well, you could have a couple days. He was like, nope, you've got to leave now. And this is a family, right, who's stunned. They were stunned by Fred's death. They were stunned by this sudden change. All the landlord had to do was say, oh, these people have been using serious drugs in this house forever, and so then the police were sort of more on board with getting them out quickly. And what the family needed immediately was a truck for the things and a place to stay that wasn't a shelter, and hospice does neither of those things. So what I had was empathy and witness. And I won't say that empathy did no good. I was able to talk to the landlord and the police and soften things up a bit. The police ended up deciding that the landlord was a jerk. They did use a stronger word. They tried very hard to get him to give the family more time. He wouldn't. Empathy helped me to help the family calm down enough to think about the resources they did have. I had a mother in the area with whom they could stay, some other things like that. So they gave us a space to think about those things. And I don't know whether this comes under the category of empathy exactly, but it also allowed them to be angry with me, and that was really, really helpful for them. And that's actually often a big part of hospice social work, because we're the bringers of the bad news, right? We're the ones who come in and say, no, actually, this is happening. And sometimes that's good news, sometimes it's a relief. People kind of go, oh, phew, finally we can talk about what's happening. And sometimes it's we don't want to know that. So what I wanted to do was stay and help them pack. I'm not sure they would have wanted me to. I'll never know for sure. What I had to do, I was still a fairly new social worker, was go on another visit, someone who was angry that I had canceled the prior week because I'd had an emergency and was not going to take it kindly if I did it again. Also, the Medicare system, as Duke Hospice interprets it, demands that social workers make 4 visits a day so that we're productive. According to the system, I should not have gone at all to this house because the patient was already dead and so therefore not productive. The visit wasn't considered productive. And I felt really like I was in an episode of The Wire, seeing how the system I'm a part of was failing these people. What they needed doesn't seem so hard. A truck and a place to stay, somebody to help them pack, a system that would allow the police not just to know that the landlord was a jerk, but to do something about it, and my own courage. I would have liked to have more courage in the situation to say, I'll stay and pack with you rather than go on this visit. And just to have more to do than say, I'm so sorry, we don't have a truck. I'm so sorry, they do have the legal right to evict you. Without making excuses for myself, I also want to say that I think the system matters. If I were in a system that valued the staying with the family rather than the leaving to make my quota, I believe it would be a better world, right? And so I think how we set up systems, think about systems, reacts to them matters. I'm sure everybody has their own systems they can think about here. And I think I just want to leave that there for now. And then you can, is it set up so that Leslie responds, or how do you?
Leslie, do you have anything that makes you want to ask?
Oh my goodness, so many. I feel like I already have my mental 12 pages. That was really, a really powerful response, both to what feel like some of the big questions and engines underneath the book, and just powerful stories. And I especially, well, a few things. I feel like I'm really hearing what you were saying in response to the son who said you must really detach, and drawing that distinction between detachments and sort of not shutting off the feelings in response to truly difficult situations, but figuring out how to have an emotional infrastructure in place that gives you a way to have those feelings, but not just put them right back into the situation, sort of take them somewhere else. That I was talking to a nursing student audience about compassion fatigue right before the panel started, and it seems like the sort of answer to compassion fatigue doesn't have to be shutting off the compassion. It can be sort of figuring out how to deal with it. And I guess one of the questions that I have has to do with, well, a number of the things you raised, but it's ultimately a pretty basic question, which is like in the system you work in of offering care to people at the end of their lives, sort of what are some of the ways that you feel like the system could have more empathy, and whether you want to kind of tackle that question on a logistical level or more theoretical level, that sort of how could we build a system where it might be more responsive to the needs of that family on that day of eviction, or that just sort of had more space for sort of the lessons that empathy could teach or what it could show.
Right. You want to say something about that now?
Yeah.
I mean, really quickly, I would say that a system that encouraged the kind of self-care that you were talking about in terms of the infrastructure of emotion would be one thing that would be really helpful. And I think also a system where if I called in and said, which I did, I called in and I said, what we really need is a truck and a place to stay that's not a shelter. We don't have either of those things, right? I knew we didn't, but I was hopeful that maybe there would be a miracle. And they said no, and they wanted me to get on with my next visit. You know, I think there's an education thing there, because they're always also worried about the press gaining reviews. I don't know if any of you have ever spent time in a hospital, right? But when you get out, you get a little review that says, you know, how was this experience for you, and rated on a scale of 1 to 5. So hospice too is always worried about that, and I feel like I tell them over and over again, if you really care about the press gaining reviews, let me stay and pack with these people, right? Don't make me have 4 visits. Let me spend this time. And that goes even bigger, because then we have to get to the Medicare requirements and all of this. I mean, it's not that they're cruel people. It's, I think, the structure of what we consider productive in some ways. Others may have thoughts about some of this too, but when we open it up.
Yeah, let's wait till we open it up. Why don't we turn to you, Lauren?
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here,
Sure.
Diane, Michaela, and Lou, and both of you. It's an honor to show my work at such a young age, and it's such amazing work. I really love what both of you are doing, and also my teachers and my parents who flew in, and all my friends who are here supporting me and have supported me throughout this whole process. It means a lot to me. So many of us had the opportunity to read and, I don't know, engage with Leslie's work. And for me, I think it's kind of helped me crystallize a lot of feelings that I've had my whole life and have been searching for the words for. I'll get more into that later. But so I'm the first of 4 girls, all born 38 months apart, from start to finish. My mom used to tell me that I was really sensitive growing up, and I never knew what that meant. But I knew at a young age that I was a little bit different. The way that I responded to people was different. As a 3-year-old, I would hear my mom leaving the room of my twin little sisters to go breastfeed, and I would go help her. And I know you're thinking a 3-year-old might be bad at breastfeeding, but I was like pretty solid. So this is my work. For many years, I've been interested in the scars of other people and allowing them to tell their own stories. This is my senior thesis and my graduation with distinction project, but it started when I was in 11th grade. And started as a group of images and has now transformed into an installation piece where you walk into a black box and you'll hear people telling the stories of how they got their scars. And so At times you'll see an image, at times you'll see video. It's all black and white, it's all anonymous, and at times you'll just be in the dark listening to their words, and so I'm hoping in those moments of darkness can cause individuals to kind of reflect on their own pain and how we respond to the pain of others and how we think about the pain of others. So you're probably looking around this room and looking at me and wondering why someone like me with no visible scars would create work like this. And the answer is that I don't have any scars, none that you can see. Growing up, since I was born, my dad has had a disease called psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, and this disease is a genetic autoimmune disease that it's the arthritis component is solely on the interior of your body. Your cells are overproducing and causing inflammation in every joint. So I'm sure you all know what joints are, but just to put it in perspective, it's every single thing that bends. So you guys are sitting at tables, you have your hands on your head, you're scratching your head. Anything you do with your body, you're using your joints always. And so I like to describe this disease as a disease that, you know, you feel like someone's poured cement into your body and it's dried up, and then how are you supposed to bend? How are you supposed to move? What are you supposed to do? So at a young age, I was very sensitive, and my dad wouldn't complain, but I still tried so hard to kind of connect with his pain. I didn't understand what he was going through, and I wanted to so badly. I was constantly trying to connect, and so the hardest part about all of this, about my dad having this disease, was I would hear every single day that I was my dad's mimic. I was my dad. They could see it in my face. They could see it in the way that I walked, in the way that I talked, in the way that my brain worked. And my whole life I just kept being told that you're so much like your dad. And so I read a passage in your book that I'm going to read that I really identified with because I kind of had this projected version of myself that was outside of myself as an individual, but it was myself with this disease. And so I knew that there was a part of me that also had it, and was trying to battle with that. So in your book you say, during the months of and also you read it so beautifully that I'll do it in my words, but during the months of my brother's Bell's palsy, whenever I woke up in the morning and checked my face for a fallen cheek, a drooping eye, a collapsed smile, I wasn't ministering to anyone. I wasn't feeling toward my brother so much as I was feeling toward a version of myself. A self that didn't exist but theoretically shared his misfortune. And I never really understood what I was doing or why I was doing it or how I was doing it, but when I read that, I just all of a sudden kind of understood like a solid 15 years of my life. Wasn't able to put into words. So I have another. I'm gonna now fast forward to teenage Lauren. I was a huge jock. I was the captain of my basketball team. I threw the discus. I was always running around in my backyard, and I don't even know. No shoes on. That whole thing. So all of a sudden I started breaking bones a lot, and we didn't know what was going on. My parents were kind of concerned, and I think that maybe they always truly knew what was going on, but there was no manifestation on my body, so how were they supposed to know who was going to diagnose me? It's genetic, but where are the signs? They weren't on my body. I was really lethargic and just really, I don't know, not myself anymore. And I think after about 2 years of going to see a bunch of doctors, I was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis. The disease that I had always imagined myself having, but never knew, I don't know if I would have it or how that would work. And this was in my junior year of high school. I was homeschooled. I was put on a form of chemotherapy that made my hair fall out and made me lose weight and made me turn green. I had to give myself injections. I couldn't walk, I couldn't sit, I couldn't sleep. My dad had to pick me up out of my bed at times and put me into a bath so that I could soak and just, I don't know, maybe feel something. It was the year that I was supposed to take my SAT, and I was supposed to take AP exams, and I wanted to go to Duke, and how was I going to go to Duke if I couldn't sit in a classroom? And my friends didn't understand why I couldn't be in school. They said, "You look so normal, you look so perfect, I don't see any pain, I don't see any problem." I was out of school for 9 months one time, and I was asked if I was secretly pregnant. And I was like, no, I'm not pregnant, but since you can't see it, I guess you don't understand. So in my head, I was thinking, so if I don't have anything to show, does that mean that I don't have anything? Does that mean that there's nothing that you can connect to, or there's no way for you to understand? And just imagine being in that pain all day, every second of the day, with nothing to show for it. So in your book, you say this quote that at times I've questioned myself, and this has pushed me to realize that I know less about myself than I ever thought, because I haven't really dug so deep into this, I don't know, thought process of why I do the work that I do, or why and how I want people to respond to my pain. But you say, part of me has always craved a pain so visible, so irrefutable and physically inescapable, that everyone would have to notice. And so that stuck with me. I think I circled it like 10 times in your book and underlined it, and I had never been able to say that before, but just realized that that was everything I'd ever thought. And I felt a little bit, not embarrassed, but it just made me think a lot about how I had expected other people to look at my pain, and it I don't know, made me just realize a lot about myself and a lot about the way that I expect other people to respond to me. So when I stopped playing sports, one day my mom left her camera by the front door of our house, and I decided to take her camera to swim practice. And so I realized that although I couldn't move myself, I loved watching people move. And so I started taking pictures of people moving. And when I was finally done with my homeschool after a year, I was finally on a cocktail treatment that let me be able to semi-function as a normal human, go to school for part of the day and sit for the SATs. I enrolled in this photography class that changed my life, and I decided that I needed to kind of figure out a way to start to explore this idea of pain. And so I started photographing individuals who had pain that manifested itself on the surface of their bodies. I shot it with black construction paper hung on the walls, and my parents were holding flashlights, and we didn't really know what was happening, but I had a disease that existed solely on the inside of myself, and I had nothing to point to when people asked, and there was no scar. And people, because it wasn't on my body, you talk a lot about bodies and about being able to connect to a physical body, and there was the people just couldn't understand me. So I decided to create this collection of anonymous scars and the way that they manifest themselves on the body. And so through this experience, it has been the most cathartic experience that I've ever had in my life. I've been able to look at the scars of other people, talk to them about my pain, have them talk to me about their pain, and then we relate to each other. We understand each other, because I'm not just pointing at their scar and saying, "Oh, how'd you get that?" And not caring more about their pain, but I had the ability to just really go into a deep exploration of what was going on with them and what was going on with me. And so you also talk about re-articulation, and so my hope for this work was that, first of all of these people, these images, these people would have the ability to talk to someone for the first time who cared about why they were going through this pain, but also I wanted to see if other people had the ability to connect. And so I think that the experiences of others can serve as kind of a re-articulation of maybe what people are going through. You talk a lot about your story, your confessional being a re-articulation to other people, and so hoping that these stories can at least, I'm not suggesting that empathy will be created or can be taught or anything like that, but getting people to think or think more than they were before, or if they're disgusted, or I don't care how people respond. I just wanted people to start reacting and to start thinking, and I think that it's something that a lot of people, we don't think about this so much, and it's so much. We had a conversation last night about, you were like, well, it's like breathing. This is so much built into who we are and how we act as individuals, and I just really wanted to get people to start thinking and start questioning themselves, and if that was all that they did, then that was a huge success for me. So, like you, I started getting emails and messages from people who were just emailing me their life stories or asking me to be photographed and to be part of this. And yeah, I think that the purpose is not to provide answers for empathy, but to see where your empathy will take you and to give yourself questions. So, me participating on this panel, I guess maybe you thought that you were just giving a college student the opportunity to come and present their work, but your book kind of smacked me in the face in the best way possible, and scared me a lot, but made me question myself in ways that I always needed to question myself. And I don't know, I'm starting to talk about things that are hard. I never thought that so much of the process of me healing and the process of me understanding my disease was about this subconscious need for empathy that I've always had, and just really wanting people to understand my pain. And so this work was my exploration of that, and I don't think it will ever end, because I don't think I'll ever have an answer for, or I'll ever have people, really understand what I'm going through. Everybody's different and everyone's built differently, but this has put me in a place where I have something new to step off of, and a new way to explore myself and my own work. And yeah, I just have really enjoyed reading your work, and it's been really interesting to see the parallels that we've had. My roommates can all attest. Every time I read the book, I was like, I feel like we know each other already. I don't know. I think we're gonna have a lot to talk about. So I just want to thank you for making such a beautiful book and putting so much of yourself into it, and it's really changed me a lot.
It's like the embarrassing moment when I tackle you. This is like one of the most powerful experiences of my life as a writer, honestly, to be up here and to hear, just to hear, not just sort of how my work is landed, but what you all do, and I have this feeling of reckoning with these big unanswerable questions that sort of having company and that reckoning is amazing. And I think, there's so much to say about your work and so much that I want to ask you. I think part of what I feel so powerfully just listening to your narrative and the life and the family life and the sort of your personal experience of pain and how it brought you into this work, it's so incredible to think about the way that sort of what you've gone through has made you turn outward also, and I know that one thing that I've been thinking about is how kind of ultimately it's inseparable our experience and our experience of other people's experiences are, but this sense that sort of having gone through what you've gone through has given you an ability to witness other people's pain and to figure out a way to show that pain through several channels at once, and not just the pain but the healing as well, which is part of what's so powerful about a scar. Is it's like the record of something that was damaged and also the record of the body recuperating itself in some way. But when I look at these photographs and read the narratives beside them, and also, you know, what you were showing me where I got to experience images alongside voices narrating that pain, I was struck by how powerful it was to experience both at once. That somehow if I was just hearing a voice narrating an experience, that would be powerful in its own right, but somehow being called back always to the body, that image of the body, I was kept thinking about like the way that like sort of synapses work, or they're like two things, and somehow it's like the movement between those two things where the charge lies or the power lies, and then watching these bodies and hearing the voices gave me something that neither one would on its own. And so I love that it's kind of this ongoing experiment with you're gathering records of what people have gone through and are just thinking about the most powerful ways to offer those records to other people. And like you said, to kind of not necessarily to prescribe a certain sort of emotional reaction, but to create a space where some sort of reaction is happening. And I'm curious, I guess one place to start might be asking you to talk a little bit more about what's created for you in the space of the kind of photo booth or the black box that you were describing, and in particular, wanting people to have these moments where they might just kind of be in the dark with themselves, and sort of what you imagine might happen in those moments where they're both encountering somebody's life or their story, but also encountering a kind of a moment of quiet or absence, and what that absence holds.
So I think that the absence of, I just want like maybe some reflection to happen. I think that there's so much power in being alone with yourself. I think that's like one of the scariest things that, for me at least, I love spending time by myself, but also when my thoughts are the scariest of, you know, I mean, my parents could tell me things, but when I'm alone with my own thoughts, that's when I'm really exploring things that I could never imagine. And so I'm hoping that through viewing the pain of others, you talk about it, rather than it being like indulgent, it opens up the ability for confession. And so I'm hoping that in those moments, individuals will know that they're not alone, that this person is here confessing their pain, and that they can think about it too.
Right. That seems so powerful, and also imagine it's sort of a, I mean, I love, again, it gets back to that question of inseparability. Like, sometimes in writing it comes up, like people will talk about the I entering into an essay as somehow antagonistic to the other, or the subject of the essay, and to me that can happen, but it's more interesting to think about the ways that the I and the you, or the she or the he in an essay, that they can be deepening each other's stories rather than kind of competing for space or competing for visibility or attention. It seems like the installations that you're imagining and making and putting into the world are ones where the kind of the I of the person experiencing the work and the subject who's being documented in the work, and then also you, Lauren, as maker of the work, who's somehow also in the room, that those figures aren't kind of competing for space, that somehow each is making each story is sort of making more room for the other stories rather than it being some finite economy. And that it strikes me that in those moments of darkness or silence, you get, as a viewer, you're sort of pulled back into your own body too. You're sort of aware of yourself as this figure in space who's seeing this body and images, or hearing this voice, and that's sort of powerful too, to be kind of embodied in that moment of encounter. I actually feel like I could talk to both of you about your work endlessly. I don't know whether we were gonna.
Well, I was going to ask a question, but I actually think that there's probably a lot of questions out here in the audience. So whether it's taking up anything that Jehanne raised, or Lauren raised, or that Leslie has raised, or something that has been raised in your reading of the book, bring it on. Let's let's hear what you have to ask. I'll start it off. And I do want to ask, because it struck me in listening to the three of you speak, that this must be encountered by you, either in your artistic work, in your social work, and probably in your research work, and in your writing work. And that is this question of what kind of pain is acknowledgeable, and whose pain is legitimate and whose isn't. And I'm thinking of, there's a very obvious essay of Leslie's in this collection on Morgellons, but I wonder, like, how often does that come up for you? How much is that a part of your thinking about the work that you do, and how do you reconcile that? Do you ever ask yourself, like, is this pain I should acknowledge, and is this not pain I should acknowledge in some way? Or is that a question that you elide and go past? And how do you work through it? And any of you want to take that up?
I'll just speak quickly, but I think that everybody feels pain for a reason. We're human beings. We're all built differently. We're all made differently, and we all experience pain differently, but we all do experience pain. And I think that it's incredibly important that we as individuals accept the pain of everybody. I think that pain is one feeling that connects all of us on such a deep level. And so I know that maybe isn't how everybody responds, but I think that that's how I see pain, at least. And you brought up the idea of compassion fatigue, both of you, and I've thought about that so much in my life because of my own experience. But I don't know, for me, pain is something that's just so important and so built into every fiber of our being, and I think that it should be acknowledged always.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it was sort of in a way, part of what I was feeling when I was thinking about how incredible it was that you've sort of turned your experience of pain into something not totally inward or solipsistic, but something very outward, something that's sort of the ways in which you struggled to have your pain be something that was visible to others has made you figure out ways to make other people's pain visible, and to think about visibility in a more nuanced way, that like a scar is already visible, but part of what your work is asking us to see is seeing that as a partial visibility, that a scar shows us something, but it actually doesn't show us very much. And so then when we read these or hear somebody's voice, we realize sort of how partial even the visible manifestation of the scar is. And I was thinking about in the second story, the eviction, part of that seems to get back to this idea of what sort of pain is acknowledged or visible to the system, because the hospice system is designed to sort of care for people towards death, but what you're pointing out in that incident is like that there are all sorts of pain and trouble and need for care that arise outside that framework. And so how can we think about a system or think about how to be actors within a system that sort of pay attention to pain outside the margins of what is officially asking for care?
Right. And I mean, I think just to agree with and add maybe a little bit to what you guys have said, I agree that there's no pain I think should not be acknowledged, but I do think there's different levels at which it's possible to be with it, I think. And I also have learned, I've learned actually with people, when I've been in places of great pain, that there are very few people who can actually effectively sit with me through that, who can stand it, right? And so you have to pick your people and trust that there will be those three people. They might not be the three people you'll expect, but there will be three people or some number of people who'll be able to do that with you. And also for me in the hospice work, there's some people I can really be with in their pain. I think I can effectively accompany them. And there's some people I can't. Like, one of the things I know is hard for me is if somebody denies that the other person is dying, that's a place I have to do a lot of work, because I sort of want to go, but you only have 6 months and I want you to make the most of it. It's like, well, they might be making the most of it in a totally different way, right? And so I have to really step back. But so I think it's, pain is, as you both have shown, but Lauren, just so powerfully thinking about right now, when it's not visible, then that does complicate that. And that's something I run into with patients and families too, that many of the pains are old family pains, right?
Mm-hmm.
That get exacerbated. I think we all hope, it's the last thing I'll say, but I think we all hope in a situation of pain that people will come together and support each other. But pain is stress, and so what most often happens when we're under stress is we regress to our corners, right? And so very often what happens is people aren't able to support each other, it's a big imperative. Mom's dying, we should be able to support each other. How come we're acting so badly? Well, of course you're acting bad. It's really hard.
Just to add to what you just said, it's so interesting to me to read these quotations on these photographs and notice how little they are talking about the actual physical pain that caused the scar. I mean, a few of them do, but all of them seem to talk about, the attendant psychic pain or, personal pain, how I feel about it, how I think about it. And that's what they want to talk about with regard to their scars.
And that's not what people ask about.
They ask, like, how did you
get it? What happened to you? Like, whoa, that's gnarly. How did that happen? Or something like that. And that's why I think that this work has been incredibly cathartic for not only me, but the individuals, because people are talking about it for the first time. No one's ever asked them before. I had I photographed one of my friends who had a breast reduction surgery, and she said that that it was an interesting experience for her because it was something that was so invisible to other people, but something that no one had really, spoken to her about and talked to her about, and that was
Did she want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she had never thought through a lot of what we talked about, and then at the end, it was like, whoa. How I never really thought about any of that until you started asking me questions. That was a really big moment for me because that was just a time when I realized that the work that I was doing started to get people to think about things that they had never even thought about themselves.
Well, isn't this a thing that, and I want to include everyone in this discussion, but isn't this a thing that we do sometimes when faced with someone who has obviously experienced pain or some affliction, that we try, initially at least, until we feel really comfortable, avoid talking about it at all? And it's been something that since I've grown old, I'm old. Since I've gotten older, I've become less likely to do that. But when I was younger, I had this experience recently with a woman who has retinitis pigmentosa, and she's in her the last months probably of being able to see anything, and we had just like this really incredible talk about blindness, which I would have never broached once before. I think maybe because of my own pain and experience with pain, and knowing that I wanted people to ask me about it. You don't always know. We avoid it. Does that sound familiar to you all?
Well, I just kind of think people ask, but they don't want to know. So you get these really surface level questions, kind of what happened to you physically, but no one wants to know, like, what the scar actually left on you, which is why I think what Lauren's doing is so powerful, because in her ability to connect with these people one-on-one, you're breaching the physical and approaching so much more of the mental and emotional. And at the end of the day, like, that's the true scar. Because when you have a scar, it kind of heals over time and you forget that it's there, but like what's in your head is so much greater.
I was thinking when you were talking about that, about a good friend of mine who's a trauma therapist, and she talks quite a bit about the way that certain things have filtered into our language that are so commonplace now that we don't even hear them for what they are anymore. But phrases like, oh, you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, or, you know, that kind of something that is an act of caring for how somebody else feels, or not wanting to force them into difficult territory or bully them into talking about something. But there's also an element of it that's kind of safeguarding everybody from the material that's too hot to touch. And so I sort of think about the peril of that, of creating these comfortable grooves whereby we all avoid the hard material, that as a peril on one side. And then, but I also think about one of the first events I did with this book was, I mentioned it this morning actually, about this, speaking to this group of outpatient mental health clinicians who worked at this clinic in Waterbury, and it was essentially it was a public clinic. I mean, it was basically a place where people went when they had exhausted other resources. I mean, a lot of homeless people who really were like they were the people that other people would cross the street to walk away from, you know, and they were coming here for care. And one of the things that those clinicians were talking to me about too was also respecting the boundaries. And you don't go into the hard stuff the first time you meet with somebody, or the second time you meet with somebody, or the third time you meet with somebody. That there's also an importance in respecting that, and that the ego of the practitioner can sometimes want to get actually into the hard stuff faster than it's better for the patient. You know, so I sort of think about that on the other side, and I imagine that comes up in all sorts of ways in your work. And one of the things I hadn't thought about before was the way that mortality sort of pressurizes in the opposite direction.
You might have one conversation.
Yeah, exactly,
right?
exactly.
So, yeah.
And my mother actually has done quite a bit of work as a hospital chaplain, and she talks about time in a pressurized way too, because often it's like the first or second time she's meeting somebody, but they need something very intense from her in that moment. But just sort of thinking about those as two poles of peril.
Yeah. Gotta stay on time. Lou.
So I wanted, first of all, this is so great, so thank you for letting us sit in and listen. It's a great conversation. So I want to bring up one of your essays, Leslie, and the ways that I see it connecting with these other stories that we've been hearing today. And it's the essay where you talk about getting mugged, and you say, somebody's asking you, what did they take? And you say very emphatically, he took my face. You know, I mean, that's what you're saying in your head, you know. And I just thought that was so powerful, and I at least as I read it, it wasn't, oh, he took my beauty, he took, you know, it was more, he took from me who I know myself to be. I'm going to look differently when I see myself in the mirror, but not just because physically it changed, but because you now saw yourself as someone who was vulnerable and in a different way. And so it took an identity from you, and you had to kind of remake yourself on the basis of that experience. I don't know whether that's the way you intended it, but that's what I took from that. When I hear Jehanne talk about the hospice work, and I think about the person who's losing their physical abilities, and like at each moment, you know, I've lost my abilities, it's been taken from me to be able to go to the bathroom by myself. Having to remake yourself at each point as you experience that loss. And I look at your photos, Lauren, and as I was working on the captions, and I'm not sure whether all of these parts are in the captions, but the one that I kept thinking was a burn victim, and then it turned out it was a blood transfusion. And I thought, when that person said, I don't want anyone to think of me as weak. You know, it's so important that they not be thought of as weak, and then that the scarring then challenges that self-identity and having to struggle to maintain that. And so I just kind of want to throw that out there as something that I take from all of your work, and I see how Leslie's essay can kind of tie these things together and tie together a lot of these images too. That's just an observation.
And that's really helpful and just kind of fascinating for me to listen to, and because I do think that part of what I was thinking through with that essay did come back to questions of visibility, and the fact that kind of getting mugged was something that I felt was like a category of experience that was seen, not like in some homogenous same way by everybody, but kind of was seen in different terms than what had actually had an impact on me, that it was sort of like I cared less that somebody took money for me or something. It really didn't matter. It did have to do with having a physically violent encounter with a stranger and sort of what that felt, and that, you know, it was visible in one way right after it happened, and everything was bloody and my nose looked totally crooked, and anybody would have been able to see exactly what had happened, which is that a hand had punched it, you know, but it was visible in a different way 2 weeks after that, and a different way, it almost became harder like 6 months after that, when I was like still scared of walking alone in the street, but felt ridiculous and melodramatic and crazy and making too big a deal about it, but that really was kind of a question of visibility and sort of not necessarily wanting people to think about it all the time or pay attention to it, but wanting to maybe like not be judged in certain ways, but I think all of those were at stake about how to sort of take what was increasingly becoming like a less physically visible experience and figure out how to find some way of talking about make visible what had mattered, and sort of wanting to put that in the form of essentially just a really broken story, like taking pieces of story and sort of putting them together in a way that showed the seams or the riffs of where they didn't fit, where they weren't whole, which again is kind of part of what I really like about what you're doing, working with these different pieces of different forms of audio and written narrative and visual narrative, and then also sort of silence as a form of like acknowledging how there's also kind of blank space between the parts of the story or outside of it, and how that blank space holds a kind of important acknowledgement too.
When you were just talking about the physical manifestation, I thought about the piece about your tattoo, and how that kind of ties into a lot of people that I've spoken to have said, well, I always wanted a tattoo in my life, and now I have this. And so that reminded me a lot of when people would ask you how you got your tattoo, and it's like, how do I answer? Is it, do you want that I just got ACL surgery, or do you really want to know?
Right. That question of kind of how deep to go. It's interesting because like a tattoo sort of is, it isn't always meant as an invitation, but it often comes across as an invitation to ask, and a scar is even less. I imagine it does a lot of inviting, but without having been chosen or bidden at all. So it's sort of, and I know like women who've been pregnant talk about the way that it sort of, they sometimes feel violated by the way that it like offers them up physically to the world as an object of inquiry, but they're not asking necessarily. They're not asking to be touched. They're not necessarily even asking to be asked about it. My husband has a lot of tattoos and gets all kinds of questions about them, but he has a tattoo. His first wife passed away, and he has a tattoo on his ring finger from when he wears our wedding ring on his right hand, and has a tattoo on his left. And it's probably the one where when people ask him about it, it does create that vertigo of how deep do they want to go, because they're asking about this thing that's at once public and private, and there's obviously a very deep and hard story behind it. But part of what it means that he got it is that it does make that loss sort of public, but in this way that tells sort of this part of the story.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question that sort of takes us in a different direction. But earlier, in a way, earlier today we were watching a video from MSNBC, and it was a discussion about Starbucks Race Together initiative that they're doing. And I think that the discussion, the two people, sort of, the arguments came down to sort of empathy versus action. And so I wondered if, one, is it fair to frame empathy that way as oppositional to action? And just what you think of that sort of, I guess, corporate public initiative in empathy experiment, and how would that work, and what do you think of just someone trying to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first part I can probably have a better response than the second, because I don't know that much, or maybe I would ask you to sort of talk a little bit more about what the initiative is, but I mean, yeah, I think it's extremely useful and necessary to distinguish between empathy and action, or sort of think about the way that empathy can, well, first of all, empathy is, depending on what form it takes, it is already a kind of action, whether that's listening, or listening and then offering a verbal response, or listening and offering a, that empathy can manifest as action in its own right. But I think it's useful to consider sort of what are the limits of the effects of empathy itself as an action, or especially if empathy is just like an emotional feeling, or if that's the way it manifests first, is as a feeling response, sort of what good does that do in its own right? But I definitely think that considering empathy as oppositional to action, that doesn't quite ring true for me, or that it's more useful or interesting to think about the ways that kind of empathy can catalyze action. And then the question becomes how, like, or what kinds of action can it catalyze? And I was really interested when you were sort of breaking down, or starting to break down, what were the things that empathy could and couldn't do on that day, where, empathy couldn't make a truck appear in the middle of the road. But empathy could sort of bring or invite the police officers to play a slightly different role in the situation, and that in a more specific, particular way kind of started to think about that I guess I would call it just like a relationship between empathy and action that maybe at moments can be oppositional, and certainly one shouldn't be mistaken for the other, but I think empathy can usefully catalyze action.
Yeah, I think I'd add to that, I think if you take action without having any kind of empathy, it's often pretty useless action. Right? It's an action that doesn't meet its goal because you haven't understood what you're trying to do. So I think the two actually need to go together more than sometimes people think. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have probably time for a couple more. Who has a question? Ma'am.
So I have a question for Leslie, but I want to open it up to everybody. So you put a lot of yourself into the book, and you tell a lot of your own stories. And I think a lot of the nonfiction writing that most of us encounter on a day-to-day basis has a kind of journalistic aversion to self-insertion. But you talked about not having those stories, the I and the you, and the he and the she compete for space or attention. And do you feel like explicitly acknowledging your own story and your own pain and your own desire to express that pain was kind of like a prerequisite for being able to honestly then talk about other people's pain in like a really empathetic way? And then to everybody else, like how do you reconcile or involve your own expression of pain in creating empathy in the work that you do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think it both felt intuitive, but also really meaningful to hear you talk about how you you open your interviews by talking to the people you're photographing and talking to about your own experience, and I think that's part of because it sort of invites them, hopefully, and it sounds like actually, into a space of kind of comfort and openness, and allow them to relate to you in a sort of fuller way. And I think that's part of that both is sometimes part of my practice as a journalist, and certainly like when I was talking to Marjolain's patients, I did sometimes bring my own life into those conversations as a way, in that case, to show that I didn't think of them as like over there with their crazy ideas of what they were going through, and I was over here thinking about how crazy they were, but like as somebody who like when I sort of heard their narratives of their own experience, I felt like I actually identified very deeply. And again, I think it's dangerous to sort of put too much weight or assume some absolute potential for that identification, or to immediately say, oh, I know exactly how you feel or exactly what you mean, because I don't, and I also don't believe in equalizing different experiences of pain. But I think that there can be something really powerful about saying, like, what you've said, like, doesn't totally other you to me. And so in that way, it's sort of part of the process. And I mean, one of the things that, even though I know I can't control how other people read my work and don't want to, it is sometimes heartbreaking to me a little bit when the I in my essays is read as like, I don't know, I guess narcissism or disrespect for the people that I'm writing about, that I can't just give them the space and I have to crowd it with myself, and because I know that if that's how it feels, then that just is an emotional truth for the person who's read it, that's how it comes across to them. But it's so opposite to what I hope for, which is more a kind of spirit of joining the people I'm writing about in the shared space of the book. So yeah, sometimes it feels like I realize that the tension is there and I don't know how to resolve it except to just try to keep writing in the way that feels kind of most honest to my experience of being in the world and talking to other people about their experiences of the world. So
I think that's where your work is most powerful, honestly, because without that, we're just reading the stories that you've written about other people, and what license do you have to do that? You know, like, I feel like I've been given, with this disease, I was given the license to, I was put here to do this, like, this is what I need to do, and that's what it seems like for you. It seems like you're creating work that's born out of your individual experience, and that makes you the perfect person to tell the stories of these other people. And I've been kind of struggling now, like, since my piece has been progressing, about how and when and how I'm gonna insert myself into this work. Like, does it happen in the beginning? Am I one of the pieces? Do I give them a sealed envelope at the end with my story in it? Like, I've just been going through this for a long time because it doesn't feel honest to me to tell them first, really, to say that, to qualify my pain as something that gives me the ability to do this, but it doesn't feel honest for me to not tell them at all. And so that's something that I've been struggling with for like the past few months, especially since reading your book and just trying to figure out where I fit into the work that I'm creating. So I'm not sure yet, but working on it.
And I mean, I agree with you about that being one of the most powerful parts of your book, and also know that not everybody's going to read it like that. But to me, what it does is it allows all of us to explore the complications of empathy for ourselves, and that's the real gift of it. And it also occurs to me what a different place this is for, when I do bereavement counseling, for example. I actually can't talk about my pain, right? It wouldn't be appropriate. And so it's sort of an interesting to me, listening to the two of you, it's sort of interesting. There was a time when I was doing bereavement counseling right after my mother had died. And so I was gone for a while. And so people would say, what happened? How come you were gone for that month? And I'd say, I had some version of, I had a family emergency, and thank you so much for caring, and I'm getting the care that I need. That's about all we could say, and that was fine. But there was a piece of me that wondered then, does that, they're caring people, they want to know, and yet this needs to be a space. And I guess I would say this too, is most of those people were people who cared for others more than they cared for themselves. And so I would just say I want to help create this space as a place where you come to get cared for and know that I'm getting cared for elsewhere. But it's a different thing in therapy than in art or in essays.
Well, that's so helpful to hear, because in my own experience of getting therapy, I do feel like there's this like constant guilt about the asymmetry of it and the way that I'm talking about myself, etc. But it's such an important piece of it to remember, like, the system doesn't end with the two of us in that room. Like, the system is bigger and also involves my therapist getting care, where she, just to kind of remember those, all the other invisible circles.
One more question? Anyone? Well, I want to thank the three of you for being so open and honest, and also just like putting on such a powerful discussion. This was a gift. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.